Dr. Kristin Ferguson, from your experience with international social work, what are your thoughts about social entrepreneurship as an approach for empowering marginalized communities?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me to speak and to share my work with these students. I look forward to hearing about their experiences with social entrepreneurship once they come back from Mumbai. But in preparation for their trip, let me start with just a definition of social enterprises. We can think of social enterprises as, say, a nonprofit organization or a socially minded business or some type of revenue-generating venture that has a double bottom line. So essentially, these are businesses oftentimes run within social services that are trying to accomplish two purposes. One is they're trying to accomplish the purpose of profit that keeps them in business, and they're also trying to accomplish the purpose of social improvement, improvement of society, improvement of client populations, vulnerable populations, through involvement in business. Interestingly, within the field of a social entrepreneurship, you also see social enterprises that have triple and quadruple bottom lines. The third aspect in addition to profit and improvement in social conditions might be improvements in the environment. So oftentimes you have environmental social enterprises that really try to accomplish those three things. A fourth bottom line that you oftentimes see in social enterprises, especially faith-based social enterprises, which I'm sure you're going to encounter in a place as religiously diverse and spiritually diverse as Mumbai, is a spiritual bottom line. So they're trying to enhance the spirituality and the spiritual connection with a higher power in a client population or in a population that is servicing or serviced by that social enterprise. So they're very varied in their definition. But just to give you some background, social enterprises started in Europe, actually, in the early 70s in Italy, and they were actually started within social services for persons with psychiatric disabilities. So we're talking about social enterprises that started with the intention to help people with psychiatric challenges to integrate them more fully into competitive employment. So they really spread throughout Europe in the 70s and 80s and really arrived to the U.S. On a domestic front within the late 80s and early 90s. We don't see them as much within our social service field, but we are increasingly seeing the use of social enterprises in social service agencies to work with the populations that we service as social workers. So my experience in international social work with social enterprises really began in Latin America in the early 90s. And the population I've dedicated my work and my practice and my research to is homeless and street living and street working young people. And so there were some great models of social enterprise that were happening in Latin America in the early 90s. And I've attempted to bring some of these models back to the U.S. to implement in social service agencies in Hollywood that work with the runaway and homeless youth population. So what did some of these models look like in the early 90s? They were one model in particular that emerged from Mexico was called the Triangle of Solidarity, and this was a triangle of three entities. One was the government, so the federal government in Mexico was using the Ministry of Education to credentialize the young people in a particular type of vocational skill, and that skill could be welding or carpentry or artisans or some other type of business skill that the young people could be trained in by teachers at the Ministry of Education and receive a certificate. Another component of the triangle was the nonprofit sector, and this at the time was Covenant House. We have a Covenant House here in Los Angeles, and there are many Covenant Houses across the U.S. Covenant House is a very strong nonprofit that works with homeless and street living children in Latin America as well. So Covenant House was dedicated to working on some of the case management and therapeutic issues that were keeping the young people from being successful in employment, housing, substance use, mental health issues, challenges. So all of the therapy and case management was taken care of by Covenant House. And then thirdly, corporations. So really needing to have corporate buy-in for the young people to be active players in the formal economy. And the corporations in the early 90s were like Coca-Cola and Gap and some of the other apparel companies that were agreeing once the young person had gone through a Ministry of Education training as well as some type of life skills training and case management and therapy, these corporations were agreeing to hire these young people as employees. So you really see a nice example of nonprofits working with government and working with corporations to address a societal issue like street-involved young people. Then later, in the later 90s, I was involved in social enterprises in Costa Rica through the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps has a number of programs that really try to support local communities in identifying sources of revenue that will develop their communities and develop themselves personally. So one of the biggest areas of concentration in the Peace Corps is this idea of community development through social and human development, and a lot of times that's done through helping people to gain access into economic development or employment. And so the Peace Corps, what they did was allowed us volunteers to partner with organizations, and in Costa Rica I was partnering with the Ministry of Child Welfare, so much like our Department of Children and Family Services here. And they actually had a program run through the federal government for street working children to formalize their labor in cooperatives. So your students might be familiar with the term a vocational cooperative. Hopefully you'll teach in your preparatory course about the Grameen Bank, and they'll probably have an opportunity to see some of Mohammed Yunus's, the founder of the Grameen Bank, some of his projects that are actually working on the ground now in places like Mumbai. But we were using a similar model inspired by the Grameen Bank philosophy, where you form small groups of young people and train them in some type of skill, or in many cases these young people already had an existing skill. An example would be a group of young people who shine shoes out in the public spaces at bus depots and in border areas. And the young people already came with a technical skill, and they needed some type of organizational or business capacity. They needed a startup income to be able to get their cooperative up and running. It did a couple things that are of interest to us as social workers. I really saw in both instances the triangle of solidarity with Mexican street-involved young people and the formalization of vocational cooperatives in Costa Rica. I really saw a lot of changes in the young people's mental health status. I saw changes in their high-risk behavior. I saw changes in their functional status. So, for instance, their ability to have housing, or to have increased labor networks, or increased employment, increased income. And then I saw increases in their service use. So really those kind of 4 areas of mental health issues, so reductions in their symptoms, changes in high-risk behavior, so fewer instances of substance use, fewer instances of high-risk sexual behavior, high-risk drug behavior, using theft and prostitution and drug dealing as a way to earn an income, which are oftentimes common with this population in the street environment. All of these were supplanted by their involvement in a vocational cooperative or their involvement in a state-sponsored training program with the promise that they would be hired on by a formal corporation. It was an incredibly dignifying experience for them. It helped these young people to develop a sense of self-respect, something that was very difficult for them to develop in hostile environments from which they came, or in the street environment, where it was very difficult for them to develop a sense of personal responsibility, personal respect, and self-love and self-care. All of this came through involvement in these types of social enterprises.
If I may ask you a question, you've had a lot of research experience evaluating social enterprise interventions for homeless youth right here in Los Angeles. And could you talk a little bit about the nexus between participating in these kinds of interventions and the whole world of empowerment? Mm-hmm. And I would like you to sort of share your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Great question. Well, this idea that earning an income through formal means is empowering in and of itself. There's no doubt that these young people are earning incomes. Oftentimes they're earning incomes from illicit types of activities, as I mentioned, prostitution, theft, elaborate theft rings, and drug dealing. So they're definitely earning an income, but oftentimes it's a disempowering type of income. These young people are aware that it's dirty money, or that the actions that they're taking to earn this money could lead them in jail or could lead them to death. And they're aware of that, so it's very disempowering. Whereas when we're able to supplant their entrepreneurial skills with a more formalized type of labor. So being able to make a product and sell it in a store or in a cooperative that's run out of a social service agency, that is very that very much creates a sense of pride in them. And I've seen that in my work in practice, and I've been able to measure that in both quantitative and qualitative interviews with the young people in the Hollywood homeless youth agencies where I've been doing this work. So their ability to develop a new sense of self, sense of pride, sense of self-worth, sense of motivation towards goal setting in the future, sense of hope, all of those kind of terms that are consistent with empowerment are really present after a young person, say, would go through a year training program on how to be involved in a vocational cooperative. We ran a pilot program of a vocational cooperative at a homeless youth agency from 2005 to 2006, and we measured changes in depression, changes in high-risk behavior, changes in service use, changes in employment, and changes in life satisfaction and motivation. And we saw increases in these, we saw reductions in their symptoms of depression. We saw increases in their ability to reach out and seek social support, so to reach out to others for help. We saw increases in their motivation and goal setting for the future, and increases in their life satisfaction. We also ran some focus groups, and we were able to get qualitative testimonies from the young people that were along the lines of, had this program not come along for me right now, I would be out on the streets. I would be selling my body. I would be selling drugs. This program has given me a sense of pride in myself that I can use my skills to create a particular product. In our program, we were making logos that the young people designed through Photoshop software, and these logos were embroidered onto beanies, wool caps, and T-shirts. And so the young people had a great sense of pride that they themselves had the skills and the ability to be able to create a product that a local market would want to buy.
Would you say that economic empowerment in some way snowballs to emotional and social empowerment based on your experience?
Most definitely, and and maybe I'll look at it in the reverse, how the social empowerment and human empowerment leads to economic development in a community. This idea that the young people were more likely to go out and work in formal types of jobs in a community when they were empowered, when they had a sense of self-pride and self-worth from having participated in this program. So I really think that relationship between community and economic development and social empowerment really goes both ways. So you have a population that is feeling a better sense of worth and self-pride and identity and an ability to contribute to the economic development of that community. So they're more likely to go out and to choose kind of pro-social types of activities. So they're more likely to go on interviews and to pursue things like their GED if they've dropped out of school, versus going out and using drugs or prostituting themselves or using theft as a way to earn an income. And then at the same sense, this idea that the community then develops because you have pro-social young people more invested in their community. So actually going to interviews versus creating crime situations in the community. You have communities like the Hollywood area where oftentimes the shop owners are very wary of this population because they loiter, because there have been instances of theft or accusations of theft. But when you're able to remove the young people from those situations of crime and deviance, you have a greater likelihood for the community to prosper, to develop and prosper, and the businesses to do what the businesses do best, which is to attract customers and to create profit.
As part of your research examining the outcomes of faith-based services for street children in 3 different places, you also visited Mumbai, India, and since this group of students are going to Mumbai for their global immersion program, I would like you to share with the students your experience with visits to social service agencies, with visits to communities, as well as partnering with social work professionals, academicians, and field practitioners in Mumbai, and any tips that you might want to give on to these students.
Well, I'll state, first of all, that I have a monograph of our work in Mumbai. We did a 3-city study looking at innovative programs for street children in 3 cities, Mumbai, Nairobi, Kenya, and Los Angeles. And I will leave you a copy, and then I have copies for your students if they would like to use that in the preparation for visiting Mumbai. But I want to state that Mumbai is really, my experiences in Mumbai are really one of the strongest predecessors for developing my ideas and implementing them here in Los Angeles in the social service agencies. I did have practice experience doing this in Latin America, but it was really seeing the social workers in Mumbai implementing these projects, starting these projects up from the ground up. Seeing how they built a research component into tracking the young people. This was such an eye-opening experience for me to really integrate some of the research components into my prior practice work with social enterprises. So I'll give you a couple of examples and what we did when we were in Mumbai. We met with several programs, and some of them were pilot programs that emerged out of the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. The School of Social Work had a number of kind of pilot programs that started and are now full running nonprofits. So you have tremendous experience within the School of Social Work at Tata that have been able to have a small program and bring that program to scale in terms of a nonprofit organization. So several of these projects were social enterprises in and of themselves. There was a social enterprise for male young people, and it was targeted towards, it was a partnership with Levi and Gap and several other clothing industry, apparel industries in Mumbai that had factories. The young people were trained in making the bags that Levi and some of the other apparel industry companies were using to package their goods. And so there was a whole factory that this nonprofit was running that had the young people creating the bags, gift bags, as well as packaging with the logos of these apparel companies. And the young people loved it. They were able to, again, feel a sense of pride that they were contributing. They were off the streets and they were earning an honest income. They were addressing their health and mental health issues through having access to services that on the streets they really didn't have access to. We then visited 2 different social enterprises for women, and the services there, the social enterprises that we visited were gendered, and I'll let perhaps you give some ideas on the gendering of programs, focusing towards male young people and the girl child. We saw a sewing cooperative as well as a glass making, coaster making, different type of artisan making using glass, both run by girls that had been either abandoned or had been living in the streets. And again, very similar, and they were able to sell these in both domestic markets, in local markets, as well as internationally. There were volunteers that had come from Holland and Germany, places in Europe where they brought the girls' wares back to their European countries and sold them in boutique shops, and then mailed money back to the organizations to keep programs up and running and to start new programs. So there you see an example of an international model where you have the social enterprise running both in the case of an international apparel corporation like Levi, but also networks into European boutique stores that had been developed by volunteers visiting some of these social enterprises and being so impressed with the work that they wanted to find a way to help the young people expand. So my experiences in working with clients was, again, seeing changes in their behavior, seeing changes in their attitudes, in their skills. Obviously, they were learning the skills that they were using in the social enterprises. Seeing changes in their environment. They were previously kids who lived and worked in the streets, and now these were young people who were sheltered and working full-time in an agency social enterprise. And then obviously in changes in their mental health status, that they were able to address some of the instances of depression, anxiety, substance use, and trauma that are oftentimes characteristic of this population who is exposed to very difficult home environments as well as street environments. So in interacting with the clients and doing both focus group interviews and individual interviews, we were really able to sense that these had positive impacts in those areas of their lives.
In Mumbai.
In Mumbai. And then working with social work professionals, as I mentioned again, a lot of these social work professionals were trained by the Tata, and I'm sure that's going to be part of your visit, but a very strong research tradition there. So this idea that it's important to identify what your outcomes are and track those outcomes. And find different ways of assessing outcomes. So using focus group discussions where the young people have an input in what the outcomes are, as well as individual interviews, different ways to assess how well your program is working. We were, fortunate to really learn a lot when we were visiting these programs in Mumbai, to meet with a lot of the trained social workers who were using research in their day-to-day positions.
You did mention a very interesting fact about learning from a different part of the world and bringing it back to our own backyard. And I was wondering, how did variables like culture and religion and spirituality, how did they interplay as part of your understanding what social work practice in a different part of the world is? Mm-hmm. Share your thoughts on that.
In particular, in my experiences working in Latin America, as well as more frequent or more recent but less frequent visits to Mumbai and Kenya, these are countries that have religion and spirituality really ingrained into their culture. So there are very strong traditions of faith within people's language, the way that they speak and interact with each other, as well as the way that they really conceptualize their existence. So this idea that if their particular deity or higher power is willing, then something good will happen to them. If they are of service to their fellow humankind, that they'll reap the benefits of that service. So understanding those elements of faith and how they are integrated into the culture and the lifestyle is really an asset for a social worker, because it really allows a social worker to capitalize on or to use those elements of faith as a strength for working with that client population. All of the agencies in each of the countries that I mentioned, if they are a faith-based organization, they're receptive to different religious traditions. And that was very encouraging, because a lot of these young people come from family environments. Like, for instance, if these are urban programs, and they tended to be very urban programs, a lot of times the street youth population comes as a migrant population from some of the more rural areas of the different countries. And with that come different religious traditions that might not be what was shared in the capital city or in the larger urban center where the programs are being run. So it's really important for social workers to, and these organizations do this beautifully, is to be open and receptive to alternative religious views. And if a young person comes with a religious history or a faith tradition, the social workers really try to learn as much as possible from that young person and from reading about that particular religious tradition, and then being a resource broker and connecting those young people to the services. And what I did find in my experiences with practice and later through research is how much of an engagement tool it is when a young person comes with a religious tradition or a sense of comfort from a religious background, and the social worker is able to connect with that young person and connect him or her to the local resources of that faith tradition in that city. That was a tremendous asset for engaging young people in services.
How much of caste class in the Indian context had an influence on the whole social work practice scenario?
We tended to see a lot of young people who were abandoned, young people whose parents could either not take care of them due to issues of poverty, or oftentimes the parents had substance use or mental health issues that prevented them from being parents. They were very neglectful, and the kids ended up going into the streets to get their services met in the streets. Whether that's confined, whether those behaviors are confined to a certain caste, I'll leave that up to you to to talk about. But what we did see was that the lower castes obviously had less access to resources, and in less access to resources, they ended up being forced to choose between putting food on the table for their young people, or buying important medicine, or paying for their house, or paying off a debt, for instance, if they were kind of indentured to a landowner, or in an employment situation. That was common that we saw. So it was an issue of agency. That the populations we were working with and their families were oftentimes had very little agency. Their ability to choose among multiple options and make an educated decision about how they want to live their lives. Their decisions were oftentimes narrowed due to their life circumstances. And that was a behavior that we saw in the young population that was on the streets as well. They just had very few options from which to choose, and oftentimes they were doing the best that they could in the circumstances that they had.
Thank you, Dr. Ferguson. On a completely different note, could you share with the students an interesting experience that you had while you were in Mumbai, or any tips that you might want to, give the students?
Learn elements of the language. I sat on my 18-hour flight with my Hindi dictionary and I learned just some salutations, and that was such an icebreaker for me to go into some of these agencies. We did find something interesting. The social workers did speak English fluently and were comfortable in English, but the more we interacted with people in the communities from which these young people emerged, some of the slum communities, or with the young people themselves, the less and less they spoke English. And so it was so important for us to make an effort to meet them on their linguistic level and their language. And the young people loved being our teachers. They loved hearing our English and asking us how to say things, but they also loved teaching us their local languages. So tips, invest in a dictionary and learn some salutations that really humble you to learn more once you're with the people. Ask a lot of questions. Be inquisitive. You're there to learn, and these people are going to be your teachers. That's essentially all of my experiences living and working abroad. I oftentimes feel that I come back much more profitable than I leave, because these experiences have really shaped me and taught me so much about other countries and other cultures and other practices that are very much relevant for our life here, but that oftentimes we don't have a lot of access to unless we go abroad and really expose ourselves to them. An interesting experience, I remember a taxi driver who, again, spoke limited English, and I spoke my broken Hindi, and we communicated, and he ended up taking me to a number of communities. I got in the cab one day and I said, I'm really interested in seeing these types of communities. And, I listed out some names, and he was like, oh, you don't want to go into those communities. And he was very concerned for my safety, and that was very touching. He was, an absolute stranger. And he said that, I'll accompany you to these communities because I'm worried that something bad might happen to you. And so I was very appreciative that he had offered to do that. And so
you were going all alone then?
I was going to go all alone, being the social worker kind of tromping around a different country. And he had offered to kind of come and accompany me. And he ended up coming and doing home visits with me that day, and going into some of these communities. And he made a remark to me that he was very grateful for having had that opportunity to go into these communities. Some of them were squatter communities or slum communities, makeshift communities that migrant individuals had formed in different parts of the city. And he said that he was very grateful to have had that opportunity because he didn't know that this part of his country existed. He didn't spend a lot of time in those communities. He feared those communities because what usually happens is that the news presents the very negative things that come out of those communities, but not the positive things. So being able to go into these communities and be served a drink by a homemaker in one of these villages, he was as touched as I was, and that was just a kind of a bonding experience with a cab driver that I wouldn't have otherwise had. So reach out to people. Don't be afraid to ask for help. humble yourself in other people's language and other people's customs and cultures. Have an inquisitive mind, be willing to share, part of your experiences. You'll find, as students when you go abroad that we're remarkably similar in the way that we all live our lives. The particulars may be different, but that we have a lot of commonalities, and really kind of use your inquisitive minds to find out what some of those commonalities are, and then celebrate them when you find them. Your host families and host communities are going to be equally curious and interested in you, and are going to want to know a lot about your experience. So be willing to be open and to share.
Thank you, Dr. Ferguson.
Thank you.